What would happen if every one of us took Jesus seriously in that remark? What would happen if we took his advice and we did exactly what he says and we offered no limit to our forgiveness to others who have somehow rubbed us the wrong way, who have harmed us, who have hurt our family, who have cheated us? I'll tell you what would happen. There would be no grudges against people in the family or in the church. We wouldn't have church splits. We wouldn't have divisions. I'll tell you what we would have. We'd have revival. We'd have a lot of joy. We'd have a lot of worship going on because people would be doing as Jesus has said. Whenever Jesus told Peter that we need to be unlimited in the amount of forgiveness that we offer others, he began to tell a story. In verse 23, Jesus says, "Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants." So as Jesus begins this story, he says that this story is to tell you what the kingdom of heaven is like. Now, he is saying it to illustrate his point that forgiveness should be unlimited, because he says you should offer an unlimited amount of forgiveness. You should forgive up to 70 times 7. Therefore, the result of all of this forgiveness is this illustration that I'm about to give you about the kingdom of heaven. So, what is it that he wants to tell us about the kingdom of heaven? Well, he's going to tell us that the kingdom of heaven is like a king or one who was a master that decided to settle up accounts that he had with others. And I want to ask the question, what on earth would that possibly have to do with the kingdom of heaven? Well, Jesus goes on to explain that as we read it. But make no mistake, everything that we read here, it's not just a lesson in personal moral behavior. This is a lesson in what the kingdom of heaven is like. And that makes it all the more important. Let me begin to read you the first few verses of this story. He says, "The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And when he had begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. But as he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and that payment be made. The servant therefore fell down before him, saying, 'Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all.' And the master of that servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave his debts." Now, the idea of a king and his servants is something that is somewhat foreign to the culture that we live in today. It's something that most of us don't relate with. So let me put it to you this way. For illustration purposes, let us just imagine a banker. There's a banker, let's say, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And this banker has so much money, and since this is simply an illustration, we can give him as much money as we want, can't we? He has so much money, let's say, that he can lend out the national debt if he wanted to. And he has a lot of people that owe him a lot of money. And he decides one day to call the debt that those people owe him. He thinks he's got a little bit too much cash out, and he wants to call some of that debt back. And the very first person that he calls into his office is a guy that's in real estate. Some of us would refer to him as a slumlord. He's a guy that takes advantage of people. And as that slumlord comes into the banker's office, he realizes, or the banker reminds him, that he owes him not just a little bit, but he owes him $600 million. That's a lot of money, isn't it? $600 million. And here's why I say that, because in the scriptures it says that the servant owed the master 10,000 talents. And just so you have an idea how much money that is, that was more than what the entire country, or the entire countries, I should say, of Judea, Idumea, and Samaria brought in taxes in an entire year. An entire year, all three of those countries combined in Jesus' day have only brought home 600 talents a year. So in Jesus' story, A man that owes another man 10,000 talents is definitely equivalent, if not even much greater than, a guy who owes a banker $600 million. The fact is, the amount of money that he owed was more than he would ever be able to pay back in a lifetime, and that is what the point of the story is all about. And whenever that man realizes that the amount of money that he owes is more than he could ever repay, he said, what's going to happen if I don't pay it? And the banker says, well, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen if you don't pay your loan. If you don't pay me off today, I'm going to take everything that you own. I'm going to take your house. I'm going to take your cars. I'm going to take your boats. I'm going to take your business. I'm going to take all of your wardrobe, your wife's wardrobe, all of your children's toys, and everything that you have. You'll be left with nothing. That's what's going to happen if you don't pay. And at that point, the slumlord makes an impossible promise to the banker. He says, if you will only have patience with me, if you'll only give me a little bit of time, if you will only be a little bit more gracious in this account, then I promise you, I will pay you back everything that I owe you. Now, that's not a very smart promise to make, is it? Because there's no way in 1,000 lifetimes that the slumlord will ever pay the banker back what he owes him, is there? Yet here the story that Jesus gives, it says the master of the servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt. So for our story, we're going to assume that the banker was moved by the fact that this banker was asking for forgiveness, by the fact that he was asking for grace or mercy in this regard. So he was moved with compassion. He forgave the man his debt. Now let me ask you this question before we move on with the rest of this story. Have you ever heard of such a kind-hearted banker? No, I haven't either. And before you just simply dismiss this story as a piece of irrelevant fiction, realize that not only is it not irrelevant, it is very relevant, and it is really not fiction at all. Because we might think that we could never accrue a debt like this man had accrued before his master. We might think that we would never be in a situation where we could ever owe anybody so much. Well, guess what? If you think that this morning, then you're absolutely wrong. Because the point of us is that each and every person in this room has accumulated a debt that is much greater than this servant ever owed his master. The debt we owe before a holy God is so great we could never pay it in a million lifetimes. If you think $600 million is a lot to repay, that is chump change compared to what you and I owe a holy God whose holiness and whose glory we have trampled upon with the way we have gone about our sinful lives. Do you think whenever you look at your life and you think about the way that you've sinned against God, you ever sit back and say, you know, if only I have enough time to make things right, if just given enough time I could settle my account with God, if you just give me enough years to do enough good deeds, if you give me enough time to help enough people, if you give me enough time to really learn the law of God, if only I've got enough time, then I can settle everything up and everything will be okay. Do you ever think that you can do such a thing? Because if you think that, good friend, you are sadly mistaken. Let us not make impossible promises like this silly servant did to his master in the story. Let us not say, God, if only you give me enough time to make things right, I will do the right thing. And I will settle the account, because guess what? There's nothing you could do in your entire lives or the entire life of every person combined on this planet to ever settle the account that we have accrued before a holy God. Let us not make impossible promises, but rather let us simply depend on the fact that God is gracious. Like the banker was gracious, and like the master was gracious. Because if you will depend on God's grace, and you will understand what His grace is all about, then I can promise you that you will not you will not be sad that you did so. I have great news for you this morning. And the great news is that God's grace, so great and so vast that all the galaxies in the universe could not contain it. That's the kind of God that we serve. Now this servant who had been forgiven so much, who had, the slumlord, who had just been forgiven a debt of $600 million. Now to be forgiven a debt so great, he must have been very grateful, don't you think? If you were forgiven that kind of a debt, wouldn't you be grateful? Now let's see what he did next. Look at verse 28. It says, "But that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. Now 100 denarii is a few cents, maybe even a few dollars. Compared to the $600 million that was forgiven, a few denarii is absolutely nothing. But it says that that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And what did he do? He laid hands on him, and he took him by the throat, saying, 'Pay me what you owe.' So this fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you all.'" Does that sound familiar? But the servant wouldn't have patience on the other servant. Instead, he went and threw him into prison until he should pay all of the debt. Now, I want you to imagine a slumlord who walks out of the banker's office, having just been forgiven a debt of $600 million. He goes and he decides there are some debts that he needs to collect on himself. And as he goes to collect rent from all of the people that are renting from him, he comes to the home of a young lady, a young widow who has 3 children. Her husband had recently died in the war. She had never been late on a payment. She had been faithful to make all of her payments, but she had been laid off the week before from her job. And she was $100 short on the rent. And as this slumlord comes up to her, he has no compassion whatsoever. He does not matter to him that she has 3 small children who she is responsible with feeding and raising. It makes no difference to him that she's going to be out on the street. He simply says, "Pay me what you owe me, and I want it now." And not knowing what else to do, the young lady looks up at her landlord, and she echoes back to him the very same words that he said to the banker. "Oh, have patience with me, please, and I promise I will pay you everything." Now there's a difference between her promise and his promise, isn't there? Because the promise that he made was one that he would never be able to keep. But she only owed him $100. She owed him a little bit of money. She was 1 week behind on the rent. It could be made up in a few days. And she says, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you all." And even though she could keep that promise, it is not good enough for him. And he says, "I want you out of here right now." And he throws her out on the streets, her and her children. I want to ask you this morning, was that slumlord grateful? Was he grateful for the fact that that banker had forgiven him so much money? Was the servant grateful that the master had forgiven him so much money? The answer is absolutely not. Do you know how I know that he wasn't grateful? There's no way that he could have been grateful. Why? Because those who are grateful act with gratitude, don't they? Those who have been forgiven act with forgiveness. And this man was acting in no such way. It's not what he did. What you and I would do, what we should do, is not what he did. Instead, what he did